Hello, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. This is Analyzing Drug Costs Beyond You're Paying Too Much to What Are the Best Drugs. I'm Sonia Pagnano, the Executive Director of the NCPA Foundation, and we are thrilled to be hosting Catalina Gorla with TruDataRx today to provide you with a lot of really good insights on this topic. As a reminder, this webinar is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal or financial advice. The content presented should not be construed as guidance specific to your organization's legal obligations, and employers and benefits professionals should consult with their legal counsel regarding their specific fiduciary responsibilities under ERISA or other applicable laws. I do want to give you an overview of what our foundation does and who we are. So we are an independent 501c3 organization founded in 1953, and there's no other foundation in the United States that is solely dedicated to the education, disaster relief, and public outreach on behalf of independent community pharmacies. And our mission is to improve community-based healthcare access by supporting efforts that promote the sustainability and growth of independent community pharmacists, the most accessible healthcare provider through scholarships, grants, and ownership development. So this webinar is something we are hosting as part of the work being done across the nation to address the lack of transparency in drug pricing. And the lack of transparency in drug pricing negatively impacts the sustainability of independent community pharmacies and thus patients' access to healthcare. So again, we are thrilled to welcome Catalina Gorla's expertise today with TruDataRx. And if you have any questions that come up as she's speaking, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A. Catalina?
All right, thank you so much, Sonia, for the great introduction. And thank you everybody to taking time out of your day to come talk about pharmacy and transparency, things I can talk about all day long. All right, so thank you guys for, again, your time. Please ask lots of questions. I'll try to monitor the chat as much as I can. I don't know if there's a way you can speak, but I would love for this to be more of a conversation. When Sonia and I were talking about how we could contribute to the series of conversations around transparency, what I suggested was, well, what about if we talk about what happens when you get transparency? Let's assume we can get there. Let's assume you can get the information. What do you do with it? And especially as self-insured employers, once you have the ability to make those changes, what we're going to talk to you a little bit about today is how to use that power for good, and specifically for the good of your members. So one of the reasons we're talking about drug prices, obviously, is because maybe for some of you, it's gone up a little bit. To understand why drug spend is going up, one helpful way for us to do that is to look at the drivers of cost. So if we want to start kind of tackling and understanding these trends, looking at what drives those trends is really important. Lots of ways we can do this. I think one of the simplest ways is to take drug spend and break it up into three main drivers. The first being price, what you pay for a given medication. The second being mix. What are the drugs kind of in your shopping cart? What are the ones you're covering on behalf of your members? And then the last being utilization. How many, for which populations? You typically manage through like a PA strategy. When we're looking at transparency and talking about transparency in the marketplace, it's primarily around price, right? You're trying to get better visibility into your rebates. What am I really getting in terms of rebate? You want to get transparency into coupon programs. How do they really work? What are they really driving my members toward? Transparent PBMs kind of built their whole value proposition around providing that issue. So have carve-out solutions, right? A lot of them, they're saying, you're not getting this transparency. You're not able to make the decisions you need to make as a fiduciary. Carve this out and let us manage it. One of the ways they can manage it is by sourcing drugs internationally. Again, solving a unit cost problem, or kind of at the end of the day, kind of picturing this idea of finding some way to get to lowest net cost between all of these different solutions. At the end of the day, though, this is still just focused on price. What if the drugs you're covering are not very good at all? So you got a really great deal, but it's not a very good medication. Mix and utilization are two important and often ignored levers. The idea, though, is obviously it can be hard to make decisions about mix and utilization if you don't know price. So But once we can get visibility into price, and it doesn't even need to be perfect, the real more important question that employers should be asking is, what am I covering, for whom, and is it really the best? And let me show you an example of what this can look like. This is real data, by the way, from a client. And this was a client who had primarily a discount-driven model to start. So they were with a big three PBM who had, you could see, pretty decent rebates. So their PMPM plan paid, right? So not members, was about 121 in this given year when we met them. Their rebates were not too bad, right? $37 PMPM. Keep in mind, of course, they are hitting the P&L 6 to 12 months later. So they were sitting at a net PMPM of about 84, which is really good, especially today, right? I think some of you guys are already in the hundreds, right? And we meet a lot of clients there. But when we came and showed them a drug mix approach and said, what if we just first start looking at, are you covering the best drugs for your members? And are you, by the way, making that affordable for your members? This is, again, actual data. This is a year later when they adopted a mix-driven strategy. And what you see is they actually experienced a negative 23% cost reduction in their PMPM by switching this approach, by using transparency, but actually using that to modify the mix. Look at the top line. Plan paid came down almost by half. Notice rebates became like kind of a rounding error. It wasn't a big number for them anymore. It wasn't zero, but it wasn't the driver of their strategy, which meant that they were able to capture that 23% in that calendar year as opposed to 6 to 12 months later. So there's additional benefits here from just interests that would accrue on those deferred saving strategies. And the other thing that's not shown here, but is inherent in a mixed model, members saved up to 30%. So out of pocket, they were able to pass along these savings. So the plan saved 23%, but the member saved 30% out of pocket. And this is one of the advantages when you start focusing on mix. Why are we talking about mix? Why are we even talking to you as employers? You must be thinking, some of you, I'm not a pharmacist. Like, it's not really my choice, like what patients get, right? It's patients and physicians who are making choices about drugs. And we thought that too, by the way, initially, because we knew this data. We came out of, academia, and there's a lot of research done on direct to consumer ads, that $6 billion number, and a lot of research on, ads to physicians. But all in all, about $30 billion is the number, right? What pharma spends in a given year on marketing to these sources. So yeah, I mean, physicians and patients definitely get a pretty good chunk of cash from pharmaceutical manufacturers to sway their decisions. I wish we could make this a little bit more interactive, because usually I'll ask, well, what do you think pharma pays for market access, via formulary, both with PBMs and pharmacies? But I won't leave you hanging since I have no way to interact with you. But if you guessed 10x, you were correct. And this is actually probably even more than 10x, but this is just in 1 year what manufacturers spend in the form of rebates, but also discounts. There are all sorts of concessions that are being made to the supply chain, largely for formulary access. What this means is it's you as an employer who have fiduciary responsibility for your plan and have at your disposal fiduciary tools like the formulary. You have really the strongest voice in driving coverage and driving utilization in the United States. You're really kind of the more important, 10x more important in some ways than patients and physicians. So having that ability to shape this, like, this is where that drug mix strategy can be a positive, not a negative, because by taking control of your formulary, by managing that, using the promise of transparency, which is giving you that data insight, and actually making different decisions, right? Like, we're not going to get savings just by seeing what we're spending. We're going to get savings and a change in our cost profiles by actually doing something with it. The good news is that you as employers are empowered to do so, because you have a tool, at your disposal that will enable you to do that. And you may be wondering, well, I don't have to do this, Catalina, because FDA does this for us. Like, if I just cover the new drugs, like, I know I'm covering the best, and yeah, it's expensive, but it's the best, and it's because it's the newest. Unfortunately, if you hold that perception is a misperception. FDA does not require new drugs to be better than existing drugs. FDA requires new drugs for the most part. There are some nuances, but for the most part, they require new drugs to prove they're better than placebo, which is better than nothing, right? Literally. But it is not a really high standard when you have 20 other drugs on the market that already treat that condition. And most PBM P&T committees, the question they ask is a very small one, is the drug FDA approved? Very, very weak. What everybody else asks, by the way, and what you probably want to know is this new drug, is it actually better than other drugs? That's not what FDA asks. In other countries, there's an entirely separate organization that performs this function called, in the UK, it's called NICE, or as pharma calls them, not so nice. And they're independent. They're not part of the regulator, who's EMA. They're also not part of the payer, who is NHS. Kind of sit in the middle and they say, hey, new drug, you're not much better than this existing drug. Hey, NHS, you shouldn't pay more for this because of these reasons. And then NHS is then empowered to say, okay, I'll cover this under these circumstances or I won't cover it. This is why all other countries, similar to the United States, use comparative effectiveness research, which is the body of literature and the field of study that gives you the answer to this question that may sound like common sense, but that's why all the countries use this body of research, comparative effectiveness, to make decisions around building formularies, because it's a much stronger question and it really enables you as a fiduciary to make the best decision in light of all of the information. And unfortunately, it's not information, we're currently getting from the FDA, but no other regulator, by the way, does. Regulators don't view their job as being market makers. They're trying to keep poisons off the market. And it's really up to you as a fiduciary to make those decisions about what you get access to. So keep that in mind. When FDA approves a medication, they're not approving a medication on any sort of basis of superiority, but what they're actually approving is the marketing limitations for that medication. So they're saying the drug manufacturer goes to FDA and says, I want to say X, Y, and Z about my medication. Here is data to support that. Thanks to the 1962 Kefauver-Harris Amendment. Prior to that, they didn't have to submit data, by the way. But since 1962, they have to actually submit data to support the marketing claims they want to make. When a drug is therefore approved for or indicated for, it means that it is approved to be advertised for that condition or that particular kind of treatment. That's it. It's not a seal of approval. It's not a stamp of approval. It's not FDA saying this drug is working. It's FDA saying, I've seen enough information to say it's okay for the manufacturer to advertise to this population of people these potential benefits of a medication. So that's important, by the way. It's a really important thing we want in our society, but it emphatically and importantly is not trying to tell you what drugs you should cover. Using FDA approval alone as the basis for drugs to cover is basically not having a policy, because the only drugs you really can cover are FDA approved in America. So you need another standard if you want to take transparency to the next level, because otherwise your strategy is covering everything, which is equivalent to not having a strategy. Okay, so we have transparency. New is not always better. What do you do, right? How do you actually take this and evaluate things differently? There are lots of sources out there that, come across, try to help employers navigate this. But the important thing as employers to do when you have this is you've got to ask another question, right? Knowing just the price, this is what we would get. So let's pretend these 4 drugs all treat the same condition. Let's pretend that this price is net of rebates, net of every possible concession you could have out there. At the end of the day, this is still all you have, right? We don't have a lot of information. We need more information. And this is why bringing in comparative effectiveness research, which again is this body of research used globally to evaluate medications on the basis of value, helps you see more nuance. You can see when you are paying more and getting more, like in these drugs here in the lower right, but you can also see when you pay more and you get less. And this enables employers to make the right decisions for them. There isn't an answer, but hopefully what you can see by looking at through the lens of comparative effectiveness research is there are far more interesting questions you can ask of your data and of your coverage to help you craft the right coverage that makes sense for your employees and their families. Let's look at an example. I think we have a little bit of time, right, Sonia? Let's put this into action. again, I hope I will get questions throughout. We can kind of back up if we need to. So again, I wish I could ask for show of hands. Anybody struggling with their GLP-1 spend, or everybody got it under control? This might be an interesting example to some of you, but this is again real self-insured employer data. This is data from 2021. So this was prior to the kind of just at the cusp of the GLP-1 wave, that started around 2021, 2022. And all of these dots here, this is kind of how we recommend looking at your spend. All of these dots represent a different medication for type 2 diabetes. This does not include insulin, so these are all non-insulin medications. And the size of the dot represents the relative utilization, i.e. the number of members on the plan who are utilizing that medication. Along the horizontal axis, what we're looking at is a measure of effectiveness. In this case, it happens to be reduction in HbA1c. If there are any clinicians on the call, you may be wondering about other important outcomes. Absolutely, this is just you can look at this lens through multiple outcomes again and see how these drugs compare based on those. We're just looking at one for simplicity. On the y-axis, we're looking at the cost per member per month. So you can get more of a unit cost standpoint, right? Like on a monthly basis, this is what the drugs will cost us. The drugs on the left are not ineffective. They're just less effective. They, at a population level, according to the data, have less than a 1% HbA1c lowering. The drugs on the right have a greater than 1% HbA1c lowering. So again, this isn't a good or bad, it's just more or less. And what's interesting about this population, you'll notice, is that most of the spend is actually in this red quadrant. Drugs where, if what you need is less than 1% A1C lowering, you can get there with a $1,000 drug, or you can get there with an $8 drug. Again, I wish I could ask if anybody noticed these drugs here. The most expensive, most effective is actually hollowed out. This means it has no utilization on the plan. And the second most effective and one of the less expensive ones, drug M, also hollowed out. Again, I wish I could get guesses if anybody wondered why. But I'll tell you, it's because these drugs were excluded from the formulary. This is the power of formulary. You also may be wondering, well, this must be a rebate-driven plan, right? This is some kind of traditional PBM strategy. This is actually a lowest net cost strategy with a transparent PBM. So again, reinforcing this concept, we're talking about transparency. We want transparency, but lowest net cost doesn't necessarily mean the most effective. A lowest net cost strategy, especially in pharmacy, typically assumes that drugs within a class all work the same, and therefore they pick the lowest cost net of rebates, but also generics, right? And in a rebate-driven strategy, you're just looking for the biggest rebate within the class. But here's the problem with that, and where comparative effectiveness can really help make sure the right decisions are made. Not all the drugs within a class all work the same. Some are more effective, some are less effective. Sometimes they all work the same, but until you actually ask the question and use data, it's hard to tell. All of these drugs here, by the way, in the top, these are all the GLP-1s. So you can see there are some GLP-1s that are pretty effective, impressively so, but there are some that are not very impressive compared to other alternatives on the marketplace.
Catalina, we do have a question.
Oh, there's a question?
Yeah. Is there a source for us to gather the effectiveness of drugs in a class?
Is there a source to gather the effectiveness of drugs in a class? There are lots, yes, there are lots of sources. So there may not be these are where you would want to look is in the published literature. And you'd want to look for what are called systematic reviews or network meta-analyses. You may want a PhD to do that, but that's where this data lives. I don't want to do certainly happy to talk about TruData and how we do that for our clients, but all of this data is available in peer-reviewed published literature, and it's available, to whoever gets on PubMed or gets the subscription. But those are the types of studies you'd want to look for. A systematic review, which is looking at all of the different data and summarizing it either by class or by some other grouping, or a network meta-analysis that is looking at even more data and just summarizing that even further. I don't know if that answers the question, but happy to drill into more. But just to kind of wrap a bow around this, so with the lowest net cost strategy, the strategy here for the GLP-1s was there's no generic, so you pick the biggest rebate, right? But you can see that unfortunately meant in this case that the less effective GLP-1s were being used. So we talk about GLP-1s like there's a class effect, but comparative effectiveness research shows us there isn't a class effect. So at a minimum, if you're going to cover GLP-1s, cover the better ones, right? If you're going to pay pretty much the same amount of money, cover the better ones. That's what comparative effectiveness research allows you to do. That same dynamic actually is happening here because these drugs are all in the same class. So what happens when you, as an employer, choose a drug mix strategy? Prefer access to medications that are more effective, use your prior authorization to guide members to those more effective medications, create cost share that incentivize these lower cost options. Let me show you in case you're wondering. So this is an example where this client did just that. They adopted a comparative effectiveness strategy versus a lowest net cost strategy. By doing so, they reduced their costs by about 74%. Members' out-of-pocket costs for diabetes was about 40%, by the way, cost reduction. And notice it wasn't a blunt instrument. Like there was a decrease in utilization in this top left quadrant, but only for most of the drugs, it just went down. It wasn't to zero. And notice like drug A, there were some clinically valid reasons why that drug, even though it was less effective for at the population level, for that smaller density of members, this was the more appropriate medication. And that what you're seeing here is the reflection of the appeal process and the PA process that enables, those pathways to coverage in those important clinical nuances. So a comparative effectiveness approach isn't a blunt instrument. It really enables the nuance to happen, but it's enabling the members who really need those medications to gain access while making sure that everybody's getting on the most effective, most appropriate medication for them. And the goal here again is using data, using transparency to ultimately not only drive savings, but also drive ultimately value for your members. You want most employers we meet want their members to be on to have access to the most effective medications. Doing so with comparative effectiveness makes sure that you can cross both of those bridges. So some key takeaways to share. One is, hopefully you've seen through this, is that rebates are not a cost containment strategy. They're a market access strategy for manufacturers. Actually, that's what manufacturers call formularies. They call them market access strategies. Just keep that in mind. That means you. It's like how they access you and access your wallet. The second is you may want to ask, who is deciding your formulary? Who is making those choices? How are they making those choices? This is another layer of transparency, right? We want transparency not only in the pricing, we also want transparency into the processes of how things are getting added to coverage and removed from coverage. And lowest net cost is definitely not bad, but it doesn't mean best value. It may be appropriate as a strategy in some cases, but it may not lead to the most effective medications being covered. And I hope we get more questions, but thank you all so much for the time and would love questions, would love feedback.
Please don't hesitate to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A. You can also raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask live. Could you please provide examples of CER for specialty?
Oh, absolutely. Great question. So the nice thing about CER is it doesn't care if you call a drug specialty or not so special, whatever, however you want. These labels don't really mean anything because comparative effectiveness research is the method of comparing medications on the basis of clinical outcomes. So what that means is as long as you have two or more drugs for a given condition, we can perform a comparative effectiveness review. So other categories where comparative effectiveness has a lot of value in specialty are inflammatory conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, plaque psoriasis, Crohn's, multiple sclerosis. A lot of opportunity there. There's a huge spread in effectiveness of multiple sclerosis medications. Um, and that's just kind of, I think, to name a few. Asthma, in some ways, has become partly a specialty condition. That's the funny thing. Like, eczema is kind of a specialty condition, right? In some ways, because there's some medications labeled specialty. What we can do with comparative effectiveness research is evaluate drugs across all of these different designations, but also across the whatever platform it's paid on. So, for example, there are some medications in specialty that are administered in the hospital setting. So they won't show up like on a pharmacy plan. You're not going to typically pick up that drug from the pharmacy because it's maybe infused within a clinic. But with comparative effectiveness research, we can actually compare across those medications as well. So multiple sclerosis has some options that are infusions that can be compared, as does Crohn's, for example. Great question.
How can employers advocate for this in their line of work with benefits? Like to
Advocate
see
for comparative
for
effectiveness?
comparative effective research, yes.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's picking your partners, picking your vendors. When you're a self-insured employer, I think the biggest advantage is, you have the reins, and you can choose which vendors you will use to help you administer your plan, right? So at the end of the day, it's your plan, and I think holding vendors to higher standards, if you're going to give them the responsibility, is one, is understanding, well, how are they making these decisions? If it's a rebate driven strategy, how are they getting the rebates? Do they have a rebate aggregator? Do you have the ability to make those customizations? Do you have the ability to hire a consultant to help you manage this, or hire a vendor to help you manage this and work with them? I think really understanding who you have at the table is the first point. And then if you're not getting the level of service that you need, know that there are so many companies that would want to work with you and would want to support um, a more customized approach or more kind of modular approach. It's one of the biggest trends I think that's happening in the pharmacy space, is this push toward modular, recognizing this vertically integrated, carved in structure may work for some. It may be the appropriate strategy, but if you're looking at this and saying, I'm more interested in that clinical value and you aren't getting satisfactory answers, there's increasingly a lot of more vendors out there who are prioritizing it.
Someone said great content. Do you partner with the employer broker to negotiate with the PBM to get customizations on the formulary?
Thank you. I'd be happy to, I want to respect Sonia, not making this, too commercial, more educational, but happy to follow up separately. We do work directly with employers and we work directly with brokers, and would love the opportunity to speak one-on-one on that and talk about how we do that. But this is our organization. We are experts in comparative effectiveness research and bringing this to bear to employers. And as interested, my email is very easy, Catalina@TruDataRx.com. Would happy to talk one-on-one about that.
Catalina, you had mentioned even with transparent PBMs, right? Employers still should consider comparative effective research. Is there a way to communicate that then also with transparent PBMs? Is that different in any way, or is it kind of the same, depending on who you're working with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think sometimes you want to make sure that your transparent PBM not only lets you see what is going on, but also lets you do something about it, right? So in some ways, I would argue that the ability to customize is even more important, because even if they're not necessarily transparent, you could bring in your own partners. So I think the key question, if you already have one, is making sure that you're able to change your formulary, carve out your formulary, modify your formulary, without significant limitations. Now there are operational realities of, you probably don't want to make formulary changes every day because there could be some member impact. But with that in mind, I think the key is, again, making sure that transparency doesn't negate action, but that transparency enables action.
Do formulary override exceptions present any challenges when members appeal plan formulary and UM rules? Do you recommend this process not be granted with the TruDataRx model? Also, big fan of your TED Talk a few years ago. It's from Richard Lowe.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Really appreciate that. Um, do formulary override exceptions present challenges? Um, no, I don't think so. I think we have to remember that there's no like one answer for everybody in healthcare, right? And comparative effectiveness research is a population health strategy because it is looking at the average benefit in the average population. But none of us are averages. We're all people, right? And so we need better strategies than just rebates, right? So remember, this is like what we're, we can't fix healthcare by just like starting over. We have to iterate, right? So what we're iterating from is coverage is being decided by rebates. And hopefully you can see that that may not be leading to the best choices. Instead, if we were to use comparative effectiveness research as policy, you can see how we can just get to some better, better strategies. But that doesn't mean that they like the best medication at the population level is the best medication, for every individual. And that's why I think, what's important to note in this chart is that when we deploy our coverage strategy, there are still people in this red quadrant, right? That are at the whole for the population, these drugs aren't super effective. But for that individual, there might be some benefit or some side benefit to a subpopulation that these drugs offer, that there may be a patient that like, hey, that's me, that I'm that subpopulation. And that's what an exception policy, like an appeal process enables. It enables members, for whom this drug benefits to gain access to that, but enables plans to avoid paying more than they need to, right? So if you're going to spend $500 on a drug that works for like 1/5 of your population with comparative effectiveness, you can make sure that that 1/5 is going to get it, but the whole population, you're not overspending, right, for people who don't really need it and can do just as well with a $10 drug. So no, highly recommend keeping an appeal process because we want to get members access to the right medications for them and use these newer medications that, again, may not be most effective at the population level, but may have some benefit to a subpopulation. This enables us to make sure that everybody has a pathway to coverage.
I
Great
love that you
question.
mentioned that appeals process because we mentioned that at the last webinar, being something to make sure is in your contracts. Make sure that that's
Yes.
not written out of it because that really
Yes.
is good leverage.
Yes, and it just recognizes that we as humans, like, we need that human touch, right? There may be something there is something special about you, and we want to have
Mhm.
a way to make sure that everybody can be accommodated, right, in a fair and transparent way, but still not blocking people from getting access to coverage that they really need.
Exactly. Which therapeutic areas are limited in CER and which near-term trend drivers that have limited data in CER?
Ooh, great question. Really great question. And it's a really great actually parlay from what I was just talking about being about CER being a population health strategy. So there are two, in terms of like the ways to think about it, there are two types of conditions, and I'll give you examples of each where CER we wouldn't recommend. One type of condition is one where it is treated at a very individual level, either because of some sort of treatment experience or because of genetics. So one of the, kind of, it's, not really a condition, it's a family of conditions, but cancer falls into that category. Like you don't really want to manage cancer at a formulary level. There are too many nuances, and quite frankly, for many patients, the stakes are too high to use that. You really want to have an N of one approach. Not to say that there aren't problems in cancer, like there's definitely opportunities to fine tune it, but typically employers don't like to talk about it because again, from a formulary and fiduciary standpoint, it's a very difficult to do at a population level, and you really want to approach it at an N of one level, because of all those nuances and because of the reality of those conditions really require looking at that individual and all of the different things around them. The second type of condition that doesn't lend itself very well to population level strategy like comparative effectiveness are drugs that treat lots of different conditions, right? And what I mean lots, I don't mean like inflammatory conditions that treat like 5 to 7. I mean like antibiotics, that can treat all sorts of different kinds of conditions. That there again, the bigger problems in like categories like that is really getting right patient, right disease state, but it's really about stewardship, right? So there you want to make sure patients are on the right medication for the right amount of time. And comparative effectiveness doesn't lend a lot of value. You really want to have broader access. You want different tools. You want to use a stewardship model with antibiotics, not necessarily a formulary model. Just like with cancer, you really want to have care coordinators and care pathways that are rooted in the evidence at an N of 1 level and not at a formulary level. So those are the two areas I would say comparative effectiveness is not the appropriate strategy for really effectively managing care. But in terms of like the future, I think there was a question about future areas. You might be thinking like, well, that might be true for gene therapies. We're actually finding for many gene therapies, there are either other gene therapies, so you can compare them, or there are standards of care that you can compare them with and actually still get some important insights. So gene therapies, specialty drugs, traditional drugs, injectables, otherwise, pretty much everything else lends itself very well to comparative effectiveness.
Does the CER look at real world data versus just clinical trials?
Really good question. So there is some comparative effectiveness research that can look at real world evidence. The problem with real world evidence is it doesn't exist a lot. Like they're just sorry though, it's come across. There is not a lot of available real world evidence yet, but it is a growing field of study, and absolutely it can be considered with comparative effectiveness. Obviously, so long as it maintains a lot of the same rigor of all other kinds of studies. There is some important real world evidence that's come out around GLP-1 utilization, in the real world. So that absolutely is there. Again, the only problem with real world evidence today is just the paucity of the data. So much of it is they're trying to pull it out of EMRs. They're trying to create, it's often observational. Obviously, you can't really you can try to do controls, but it's still such a nascent place that the more that it's there, the more that it becomes available, it absolutely comparative effectiveness is kind of agnostic to that source. It absolutely can be considered in this data or in this type of analysis. Great question.
Question. Well, if there's any other questions, feel free to email when we send out the follow-up after this. That way we can connect you with Catalina. We'll also make sure that her contact information is available. And we are just so thrilled that you joined us today for this informational webinar, and we're thrilled to have Catalina here sharing her expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
In
Bye.
touch.